This is the third month in our series with Alan and Herb. Originally, we start out with Alan, then Herb, and then the two of them sit together and impart all their great wisdom to us. I'm going to go back to the script that I have instead of speaking off the cuff. So we welcome both Dr. Alan Berger and Herb Kaighan today to continue our look at emotional sobriety and the 12 steps. Alan and Herb will chat with us about the impact of the 12 steps on our lives. In particular, they're going to dialogue informally about step 1, looking at that step's core principle and the emotional sobriety core value. Don't be deceived by their casual conversation. It's filled with powerful gems to tuck away for that powerful foundation we're all looking for in recovery. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys. I can't wait to hear what you have to say to me because I know it's going to help me even more. Thanks and welcome. And I think I might have to convince you to unmute.
I'm unmuted. I'm Herb. I'm
and Alan is too. Thanks.
Good morning, Alan. Good afternoon to you.
Yes. Good morning, Herb.
What a journey. I know that my sobriety date is February of 1984, and Dr. Berger, I think you got sober when you were in diapers. I'm going to toss it to you. Yeah.
I just celebrated 52 years, August 1st.
Exactly.
52 years in the program. So it's been quite a journey.
And we met 40 years ago when he was the clinical director at the hospital in which my wife had volunteered to be in for her alcohol problem. I went there to support her. I got caught in the draft.
Yes, you did. You certainly got caught in that draft.
As a result of Dr. Berger's lectures, as well as his group and individual therapy, I connected to him professionally. And then after some period of time, we discovered that we had simpatico is an easy word. A synergy is a better word in terms of our way of understanding and presenting the recovery process at the very base level to deal with addiction and recovery. And then as we both grew, emotional sobriety, spiritual sobriety, the whole sense of self-esteem that Dr. Berger has opened up with his weekly workshops. And so we're really pleased to be here. And this is the first of a series. It'll probably take a couple of years to unpack. And it's very informal. In fact, Dr. Berger and I haven't even talked about what we're going to talk about today because we have such confidence in our ability to sort of like jazz musicians to play off of one another in terms of our understanding and our experience. My experience with step 1 was a 10-year process. And my experience and understanding of emotional sobriety was probably at least a 10-year process of becoming even aware of it. Alan?
Yeah, well, let me put this in context so that those of you that have not heard. So the plan is that it's a little different than what Susie said. Herb will usually kick off the steps and describe the step and the workings of the step. The second time that I will be discussing the step will be with a focus on emotional sobriety. This coming together, which is the third time, and we'll be doing this on each step, the three of us, or there'll be 3 presentations per step, will be us trying to integrate what Herb talked about with what I talked about to give you a sense of how the steps impact emotional sobriety or create emotional sobriety. See, it's probably the best kept secret in the room, what Bill Wilson said in the 12 and 12, when he began discussing step 12. He says that if we practice these 12 principles in our daily lives, that those about us, that we and those about us begin to find emotional sobriety. So after physical sobriety, the whole expressed goal of the steps is for you to develop this emotional sobriety in your life. Now, I've been around the program for over 5 decades. It's only within this last decade that this is beginning to be talked about. And in no small part, I think, because of the workshops that you and I have been doing and the writing that I've been doing on emotional sobriety. And it's very exciting because Bill hoped back in the 50s, that he hoped that somehow this whole thing about emotional sobriety would spearhead the next major development in the program. Unfortunately, it did not. I believe that our collective consciousness wasn't mature enough to deal with what you have to deal with, and if you're going to develop emotional sobriety in your life. I think we were all stuck in the king baby, queen baby syndrome, and it took a while to grow ourselves out of that. Not that I'm out of it, not that you're out of it, not that Herb's out of it, but today we are much more conscious of this and aware of the different issues that are related to emotional sobriety and that impact emotional sobriety in our lives. So today we hope to go from a broad view of the 12 steps to a very, very specific view of what is happening in step 1 as you work this step that is going to lead towards you developing. In psychology, we have a term called an apperceptive mass. And this is like a fund of information, of wisdom, of knowledge that comes together that leads to an understanding of something. And what we're going to focus on today is what's happening in this step, in step 1, that is beginning to lay some of the foundation of emotional sobriety in our lives.
And,
now,
and
go ahead, Herb.
And to further elaborate on the context, both Alan and I are big believers on a context so that we can see the big picture where the puzzle pieces kind of fit in, and then we kind of unpack the puzzle pieces so that the big picture has a lot more color. And Bill wrote the big book in 1939. Based on his knowledge and his experience, he was 4 years sober at the time. He was living in and getting sober in the Oxford group. They had 6 steps. When he wrote the book, 1939, breaking away from the Oxford group, he created 12 steps. And that 12th step articulated practicing these principles in all our affairs. He was using principle as a synonym for steps. And you can see that on page 60, where he finishes the steps and he uses the alternative word of principles there. But interestingly enough, although as complete and as analytical as Bill was, and as articulate in a wonderful specific use of words, he never once gave us a list of principles. He refers to them all the time. Big book, 12 and 12, never once gives us a list. It's kind of interesting. And then in 1958, as Alan alluded to, and that's the work that Alan started in terms of his work and focus on emotional sobriety, he used the letter that Bill had published in the Grapevine in 1958. Emotional sobriety, the next frontier. Wow, what a visionary statement it was in 1958, but it didn't get traction. And in fact, despite the fact that Ernie Larson published his book, Stage 2 Recovery, in, I think the 80s, it didn't get traction. And it's just in the last 10, 15 years that it's begun to get traction. And probably, as Alan indicated, the world has sort of evolved and developed and needed now this kind of a focus. The first step is admitted we were powerless over alcohol, dash. That dash is very important. It's not an end. It's a whole new concept. That our lives had become unmanageable. The first half of the first step is about addiction. The second half of the first step is about unmanageability. Alan, maybe quoting somebody else, has talked about sober suffering. And you've seen them. You may be one of them. 1 year, 10 years, 20 years of freedom from your addiction, grace, God, whatever the explanation is, freedom from addiction. And people are miserable. They're suffering. They have anger outbursts. They have fear, overwhelming anxiety. They have depression. I'm not getting into the clinical scientific parts because I'm not qualified to do that. I'm just observing in the meetings the level of suffering of people who, in fact, have been given freedom from their addiction. This was what we're talking about. The stage after addiction has been dealt with effectively. I was brought in by a treatment center recently to talk about emotional sobriety. After about 10 minutes, I knew that was irrelevant. I mean, they were dealing with physical sobriety. You don't go to high school until you've gone to grammar school. You don't go to college until you've gone to high school. And that's really kind of what we're doing now. Probably, in fact, the way Dr. Berger and I will now talk about it in a fairly mature and developed way, it's going to feel a little bit like college as we get into it. Principles, look it up, core value. I call them guidelines and guardrails, both the positive and the negative. Guidelines and guardrails. Alan?
Well, what I wanted to do is define emotional sobriety for a minute, because we're throwing the term out. Some of you that have heard Herb and I talk about it before, but it's important to understand, well, what is this thing that we call emotional sobriety? What is the goal of this program? And the one word that I want to come to your mind every time you think about emotional sobriety is freedom. Emotional sobriety is about obtaining emotional freedom, emotional autonomy in your life. It's a whole different consciousness, a consciousness that was grounded in I'm okay if, which is all hooked to and conditional, moves from that and transcends that to a consciousness that says I'm okay even if. It's a consciousness that's based on unconditionality, not conditions. It's a consciousness that is created by the relationship you have with the experience in your life, rather than the experience you have determining what's going on with your life. Now, a lot of us are stuck in that I'm okay if consciousness. Please don't pathologize and put yourself down for that. That's how we all start. We start this journey as human beings from a very, very dependent state of being. We are undifferentiated, and it takes a long time, if ever, to start to grow ourselves in the direction of this emotional autonomy. Most people don't. And that's the sad thing about it, when people estimate the level of emotional maturity in the United States, we put it below 50. That's not a good sign, folks. And you guys that are outside of this country can see it so clearly, right? Even probably better than we can see it. We are incredibly immature in terms of how we deal with things. But what happens here, and this is the excitement, is see, in many ways, AA is counterculture. And it's important to think of it that way, is it goes against everything that we're taught of in this culture. It goes against this idea that I am more the more I have. That's the big lie that in our culture gets fed people very early on. It's all about what you have. It's not about who you are. And that becomes a serious issue because we get out of balance. Bill talks about emotional sobriety, about humility and balance. Well, there's no balance if you're focused on having. No balance at all. And then Bill said later on, I think it was in the 12 and 12, there was never enough of what we thought we needed to be okay. Of course there isn't. Every one of us were addicted to more. If I have more, I'll be okay. If I have this, I'll be okay. If I have that, if Susie Valinsky in the 3rd grade liked me, I wouldn't have become an alcoholic. Right, Alan, right, sure. Sure, that wouldn't have happened to you. Of course it would have happened. So that's what this is about. It's about laying a foundation in our life that begins with this first step. And as Herb pointed out, there's 2 parts of it. But the essence of step 1 is the introduction to the importance of paradox. And that's how step 1 relates to emotional sobriety. Emotional sobriety is all about paradox. Step 1 is all about paradox. We admit it, we're powerless to find a power. We admit we're unmanageable to start to learn how to manage. It doesn't seem to make sense. It's like jumbo shrimp. What does a jumbo shrimp look like? Well, that doesn't make any sense. But what happens here with paradox is paradox makes complete sense. And when you've experienced, you understand what happens. There was a Gestalt therapist that was part of the early Gestalt therapy, kind of grew in different waves. I was trained, or I am trained as a Gestalt therapist, and I'm now a teacher of that specific approach to psychotherapy. And one of the early Gestalt therapists, his name was Dr. Berger. He proposed the theory of paradoxical change. He says, people do not change when they try to be someone they're not. I tried to control my drinking and using forever, and it never worked. It never worked. He says, people change when they accept who they are. Then a new possibility exists. So understand that accepting our powerlessness, which no person wants to do, no person wants to admit they're powerless, it evokes a tremendous and elicits a tremendous amount of anxiety. That means I can't do something about a situation. Oh my God, I'm helpless. Are you kidding me? That's terrifying to be helpless. But yet accepting our powerlessness opens a whole door to freedom from our addiction. Isn't that amazing? Now, who would have thought that, right? Who would thunk that way? I mean, it doesn't make any sense because paradox doesn't. It's turning reality on its head. That's what a paradox does. It flips reality on its head. And that's what this step is doing. And it's so important for us to flip reality on its head if we're going to develop any consciousness that's going to lead to emotional sobriety.
And you'll note, if you remember how we started, Susie invited one of our participants to pray a set-aside prayer. Please be conscious of the impact of that. It's not about the prayer. It's about the intention. Going right to what Dr. Berger's talking about. Flipping stuff on its head is not actually something that we can do comfortably or effectively. So we ask for help. Even in the very, 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 very beginning, we commit intentionally to having an open mind and an open heart, realizing I'm not even actually able to do that. It's not God, please help me. No, that's still staying in control. It's Spirit of the universe, whoever, wherever, whatever you are, the mystery itself. Open my mind, open my heart, bring your crowbar. I'm looking for spiritual intervention. Allow me to be a clean white slate. And I'm inviting you now to think this thought and to embrace this intention, to have a clean white board. All the knowledge, all the experience, all the opinions, etc., that I have, just not throw them away, just set them aside so that the Spirit can write on the clean whiteboard and I can have new knowledge and new experience, even with some of the basic words that we're talking about. I mean, get underneath what Alan's talking about in terms of paradox. Even in there is some mystery. Well, and you hear it in the meetings, you have to give it away to keep it. I mean, that's a paradox that makes no sense until you have the experience with it. And that's what we're talking about here.
That's true. So, Herb, what comes to mind as some of the paradoxes in your life that you've seen?
Well, I'm not sure it's a paradox, but it's certainly an experience, and it's words that I think people can connect to from even just what I said, is that the biggest experience that I had was discovering that I didn't know that I didn't know. And I really thought I'm a very well-educated person. I have a lot of great information. I'm very disciplined and organized. I'm thinking that I'm a Renaissance man until I discover that, in fact, I'm an alcoholic and I'm not a Renaissance man, I'm a Neanderthal. And the man who helped me the most said, Herb, you have a lot of information, but you have very little transformation. And so I'm not sure that it qualifies as a paradox, but it certainly turned my world upside down once I was embarrassed and processed that. And then I was willing, maybe even before I had the experience, but I was willing to follow through on the experience. And if you hear any one thing, I think from Alan and myself about this approach, in all steps, but especially this first step, it's about the willingness to have an open mind and open heart, to not resist and not impose on anything the template of our own history with it. I'm not sure that quite answered your question, Alan. If you were happy.
Oh, it does completely, because you described a paradox.
Yeah. Okay.
You went from I don't know into finally admitting it, which your ego wouldn't let you admit for a long time. There was no possibility that you didn't know anything. I mean, you were waiting for God to consult you, is really what the bottom line was. And if he did, you could straighten things out a lot better. And see, and you went from that to finally admitting I don't know, which opened you up to some new information. And see, I want everyone to hear this. See, we so much try to change ourselves by going towards what the goal is. I want information. I want this. I want to be reasonable. I want freedom. I want awareness. We want to jump right over to get to that side of the paradox. But what we don't want to do is stay on the other side and own what we need to own to get there. Like Herb was saying, every fiber in him resisted saying, I don't know. And see, if he was in like working with a Gestalt therapist, what we get people to do is own the resistance. I refuse to admit to myself that I don't know. See, that begins the process of change. I refuse to admit to myself I'm unreasonable and I have unenforceable rules. I refuse to admit to myself that I'm powerless and I'm going to try to do everything in the world to prove that I'm not. See, if we can claim that, then we create the possibility of something different. But it's not until we own these things. And I just wrote down a few of those. If I want to become someone who's less selfish, I first have to admit I'm selfish. See, I can't get to the other side without that. So and admitting I was selfish was not an easy thing, because a lot of these things we need to admit about ourselves are, quote, not good things or what good people do. And we all want to be what? Of course, we all want to be good people. Oh my God. Right. Well, the road to hell is paved with good intentions and with good people. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's the way that this works. When I could admit, finally, I'm selfish, I started to learn what it meant to think about other people and to be selfless. In fact, one of the goals, and I want you to write this down, of emotional sobriety, is learning to act for yourself without impinging on the rights of others. It's to act for yourself without being selfish. It's to act for others without being selfless. Now, put that into the paradox. I mean, that's the challenge we have in emotional sobriety. If I can own that I've imprisoned myself, then I can start to find my freedom. We have a picture that Herb and I use oftentimes of this little guy. He says Herbie's holding up the bars, but it's the Herbie in all of us that's holding up the bars, right? And when you zoom in, it looks like somehow this guy got put in prison. When you zoom out, you see that he's standing in the desert holding up the bars himself. You see, that's the story of our life. Well, until I'm saying I'm holding up these bars, I can't let go of them. I can't put them down. All of a sudden, I got this whole big thing on my board. Do you guys get the whiteboard? Now it's gone. That was interesting. When I own that I don't want to be aware of something is when I create a space to become aware of it. If I say I have too much pride to face this, then I begin to face it. See, so please understand that this is what this step one is introducing us to. It's introducing us to a very powerful therapeutic tool that changes our lives. Is by using paradox, we can now start to become what we want to be in our lives. We can fulfill our, what I call, we can actualize our potential as human beings. It's incredible, Herb. We've seen so many people change their lives with this step. And isn't it interesting? Many people say, and I think they're usually talking about the first half of the first step, is that's the one step you could take 100%. The unmanageability and accepting that in our life, I think, is something that evolves for the rest of our lives. So if you've heard people say the first step is the only step you can do 100%, I think they're half right. I think they are, that it's a partial truth. You can work the first part and you can get to a point. I have totally 100% know that I am powerless over alcohol and other drugs. There is no doubt, no question, no reservation in my mind at all about that anymore. That second part is sneaky. It's insidious. It's hard to fully see that in every area of our life, but we'll get into more about that as this unfolds.
Well, and the comment, and I'm glad you made it that way too. I've not heard it expressed that way. The first half of the first step about addiction, especially alcohol and drugs, it needs to be 100%. It's a less clear comment with regard to process addiction and or food addiction, but the spirit of it is that you get free of the addiction itself. And that's the promise of the first 9 steps. On page 84, it says, we are placed, hear the grace of that, we are placed in a position of neutrality. But then your comment concerning unmanageability, Bill says very quickly there on page 84, but we're not cured. I believe we're not cured of our unmanageability. We have a daily reprieve based on the practice of 10, 11, and 12, which I think you and I, Alan, have come to believe those are the tools of emotional sobriety. The first 9 steps are the tools of physical sobriety. The last 3 steps, 10, 11, and 12, Bill calls our way of life, our way of living. And he says, the promises will always manifest if we work for them. That brings us to step 10, step 11, step 12. We've entered the world of the spirit, and we can stay there as long as we don't get lazy, as long as we don't get complacent. We can't live on yesterday's water. We have to drink water today. We can't live on yesterday's activities and successes. We have to have our activities today. That's another thing I wanted to mention, the realization that this is a process, not an event. Physical sobriety, I'm assuming for most people, is a process. Steps 1 through 9, Bill connotes that. And steps 10 through 12 is a process. He says, actually, it's a process for our lifetime, not an event. Some people have an event, a spiritual experience, and Bill gives us Appendix 2 to explain the difference. That's an event. But most people, he says, have that spiritual awakening, that gradual, dimmer switch, revelation of light and more light and more light.
Well, so this is an interesting thing. See, I see this a little different than Herb on this.
All right.
I see the first step and the first half is the only part that's addressing our addiction.
Yep, I agree.
Everything else is laying a foundation for emotional sobriety. Yeah. And see, Bill got that, is that first you have to have that physical sobriety, right? Even Ernie Larson said, stage 1 recovery is breaking the bonds of the addiction. Well, that's broken as soon as you accept your powerlessness. Then that obsession is, in my experience, was lifted. The obsession and compulsion to drink was gone. It disappeared. Everybody said, it's an interesting story in terms of what happened for me. I was probably about 30 days into my recovery, maybe a little longer, maybe 2 months. And I went to sleep and I had this dream. And for the life of me, I can't remember what this dream was. But the minute I awoke from that dream, I awakened from that dream, the compulsion obsession was lifted. And not only was it lifted for alcohol, but I was at least a 1 pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes smoker a day. My smoking obsession was lifted. It was all of a sudden, all these obsessions to drink and use and smoke were gone. Now, somebody says, God, I wish you could remember that dream. I'd like to have one of those, right? If we could bottle that. But to me, it was that first half of that first step. I realized my powerlessness. Everything had been pointing to it up to that point. Now, the unmanageability part, I want to focus on a little bit more today because that's so relevant to this emotional sobriety issue, isn't it, Herb?
It's the heart of it. Absolutely.
It is the heart of it. See, in what we need to realize is what were the forces operating in us that made us want to manage life? What were the ideas behind that? What were the emotions that were driving that? What were the experiences we had that made us somehow get so focused on, if I could just control everything and everyone around me, I'd be okay? How did we come up with that conclusion? How did that grow within ourselves? See, I think that that's a very important consideration as we look at what's going on with this step. Now, from some recent experiences I had, you guys know that I've been in the middle of a personal crisis and stuff like that, and been doing a tremendous amount of reaching out, spending time with Herb and Roger and my sponsor, Tom, and in psychotherapy and looking at things from so many different directions. I'm starting to understand this unmanageability from a lot of different perspectives. First of all, one of the things we know without a doubt that anxiety engenders a need to control. Just think about it. Every time you're anxious, what do you try to do? You try to control the situation you're in. You see the mother that's walking up to a street with their child and there's traffic going on. What does the mother want to do instinctively? Grab the child's hand to control the child so that they're not endangered by what's happening on the street. Anxiety engenders a need to control. Well, what might have been some of the anxieties that we suffered early on in our life that created this trajectory of trying to manage things? Well, Ernie Larson says it, and many, many different psychologists say it, is that we all have a deep need to be loved, to be accepted, and to belong. And to do that, to feel that, you have to grow up in an atmosphere that you feel safe. Can those of you that felt safe in your house raise your hands when you were growing up? There were a few of you, few lucky ones. But at some point in time, I'm sure that safety changed. All of a sudden, something happened that even though you might have felt safe growing up, that when you got into third grade, fourth grade, you started to wonder, well, wait a minute. Is Johnny going to like me? Is Susie going to like me? Am I going to be accepted by this group? You see, at some point in time, that insecurity we have about whether we're lovable, whether we're acceptable, whether we're worthy of love, whether we're going to belong starts to surface. And the minute that starts to show up is when this whole control, desire to manage our life starts to show up. Just like the mother that grabs the child's hand, we're going to grab our hand and try to make ourselves feel safe. The safety measures that we use are illusions. And Herb talks about this all the time. We live in so many illusions. The illusion is that I can control people, places, and conditions surrounding me and get them to be what I want them to be. That's the illusion. And yet we do that. We try. Just watch two little kids play with each other. They try to control the hell out of each other. Don't do this. Don't do that. Do what I want you to do. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing. They call it fun. It looks like a power struggle to me when I watch those kids play. In fact, this author, Dr. Miller, says that every marriage turns into an intimate terrorism, where both parties are trying to control the other person to do what they want them to do, and they're going to use any tactics, any terrorist tactics that they can get their hands on to pull it off.
Well, Bill
Go ahead.
Bill talks in the big book about unmanageability as exactly parts of what you're talking about, and that is pages 60 to 62 describes the selfishness, self-centeredness, which he says is the root of the trouble. I don't mean it in a negative or dismissive or diminishing way. It's an observation of the existential dynamic of structural behavior. Each individual is built so that I will always choose me as a survival mechanism. Therefore, I have to control you. I have to control my environment. Selfishness, self-centeredness is the root. And he said, that's what needs to be destroyed or deconstructed is a better term. He uses the term in his own story. He says, simple but not easy. A price has to be paid. It means the destruction of self-centeredness. I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. That's where I use that metaphor of darkness and light. This whole process is the turning steps 1 through 9 from the darkness of my self-centeredness, preoccupation, narcissism at the worst, to be in connection with and consideration of other people. Step 11, a relationship with other, and step 12, a relationship with others. I am turning from my total self-centeredness to being connected to life as it's manifesting. And that's, I do believe, the essence of this journey, a process of emotional sobriety.
You know, it's interesting. We've been doing this Thursday night workshop on self-esteem and related to the steps and related to emotional sobriety. And self-esteem, one way of defining it is to refuse to have an adversarial relationship with yourself. Now think about that for a minute. Is to utterly refuse to be in an adversarial relationship with yourself. So it's interesting when we use terms like selfish, even though they're descriptive, Another term that might be a little less of a put down for us, because every one of us does this, might be self-reliance.
Yes, Bill uses that as a synonym. Yeah.
So think about that, the difference that we become self-reliant. What made us self-reliant? Well, what made us self-reliant was the belief that we had to figure this out all by ourselves. That conclusion wasn't just drawn by us independently from what was going on around us. We came up with that conclusion because of what was happening in our life, in our culture, in our family. So I don't want you, when you own this, I was selfish, don't do it in a way of putting yourself down.
No.
Do it in a way of just accepting that this is all that was available to me to be able to cope and adapt to the situation I was in at the time.
I think the Catholic tradition calls it original sin.
And look at that, right? I mean, that's a heavy one, right? I mean, my God.
Well, it's the original defect of the human nature that's where all sin flows from, or as the Jewish interpretation of that from archery, it says missing the mark, which I think is a lot more gentle.
Or we could call it the original default.
There.
See, even if you think of it as a default, it's not putting yourself down. You went to that because nothing else was available.
No, but it's my sense is it's this level of power. It's structural.
It's structural. So I was going to say that. So part of this adaptation is we're trying to control something that's uncontrollable. If any of you have gone through a trauma, that one of the things that you will conclude, and you'll hear this, whether it's a rape victim, whether somebody's been sexually molested, whether somebody's been abandoned, that person that goes through a trauma feels like they did something to create that situation for happening in their life, that they created that situation in their life. Now, when you look at it, they didn't do anything to create that situation. I don't care what the hell that was going on in that situation. But when we come up with this idea that I did something to create it, what am I doing? I'm saying that I could have controlled this. It could have been different. You see, and that's what I'm trying to emphasize here, this desire that we have to make that we think that we can make our lives manageable really makes our lives unmanageable.
And this is where the compassion for ourselves comes in, to embrace with humility that I am inherently flawed. It's not my fault. It's a defect of body in terms of addiction, of mind in terms of addiction, and of spirit in terms of unmanageability. But that in fact, I do have the power of choice. And that's what steps 2 through the balance of the work is to enable us to then take responsibility by connecting to somebody or something that we walk in partnership in terms of the rehabilitation of our relationship with ourselves and with others and with life itself. And that's that whole process of emotional sobriety.
But look at how I'm going to push this. So inherently flawed, let's change that with I inherently adapt to the situation in the best possible way that's available for me at the time. That doesn't make me defective. That makes me a human, being. That's what we do. And so if we can try to move away from all of these put downs, we are not going to get better by putting ourselves down. I will tell you that over and over again. People do not get well by seeing what a shit they are. I mean, that doesn't work. That drives people in the other direction. I got well by somebody having faith in me that I was more than I could see that I was.
One of my teachers says we have an innate core of goodness.
There it is. And how is that, measure up with the inherently flawed? See, it doesn't work. See, that was with the big split, right? That happened because of original sin, inherently flawed, all of that stuff. then psychology came along, especially the humanists, and said, wait a minute, what if we stop thinking of ourselves that way? What if we just think of ourselves? Rollo May said this when he was talking about when people become, we don't use the term anymore, neurotic, but some of you still may know that term, right? He says, what if we stop seeing neurosis as what was wrong with us, but rather as a way that a person was trying to maintain their existence, trying to stay centered, trying to salvage enough of themselves to get by in the world. And of course, it was from a compromised situation, because if you only have a couple tools available to you, you can only build a certain thing, right? If you got a wrench and a screwdriver and you don't have a hammer, you might not be able to create something that you could if you had a hammer and saw and all those other possibilities. But that's what we do in our life. That's what we do. We adapt. We adapt. And so part of this step is also say, give yourself a break. You don't have to be who you think you have to be okay. And you got to hear this. This step says, who you think you were supposed to be, who you think you should be, who you think you have to be to okay is not going to lead you to okay.
And yet on the other hand, maybe the paradox is that I'm not okay.
That's right. See, that's
the
paradox.
Step one really is, I really am not okay.
I'm not okay.
I'm not okay. I mean, I have several cracks in the system here that are bringing me to addiction at the very least, and unmanageability at the very most. I'm not okay, and there's a role here for me to get some repair.
Yes, that's right. So another way of thinking of emotional sobriety is integrity. And think of integrity as wholeness, not as a moral issue, but as wholeness. We are starting to put Humpty Dumpty back together again with step number one.
Well, and the real point of all of our conversation, the distilled point of the principle, as I have seen it anyway, I look forward to your comments, Alan, for step one is honesty. And in fact, Bill says rigorous honesty in the very beginning of chapter 5. How it works, the first 3/4 of that page are all about honesty, rigorous honesty. If you have the capacity for it, you'll probably be okay. If you don't have the capacity for rigorous honesty, you're screwed. I mean, that's not in the big book that way, but essentially that's what he says. If you're constitutionally incapable, meaning natural, biological, physiologically incapable of being honest, you're not going to make it. But if you have a mental and emotional defects, you're probably going to be okay if you have the capacity for honesty.
So here we come to another definition of emotional sobriety: an honest relationship to reality.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, that's, and in fact, rigorous honest or radical. I just saw some person, the author, used the term radical honesty with reality, meaning the reality of life, the reality of me, and the reality of you.
There it is.
You know,